The revelation of Daenerys Targaryen as the final ultimate villain of Game of Thrones will undoubtedly be one of the most controversial TV twists ever. To the majority of viewers, Dany's transition from hero to villain was at best jarringly abrupt and poorly developed, and at worst literally unbelievable. The assumption that in the end, Daenerys will be the bad guy of A Song of Ice and Fire is still a hotly disputed and discussed element of the story, and unless or until Dany actually burns King's Landing in A Dream of Spring, plenty of readers will probably rationalize away any overt signs of villainy. And realistically speaking, even if she does decimate an entire city, some diehard fans will never see her as a genuine baddie. It comes as no shock that my opinions regarding Daenerys being a hidden villain are some of the most debated and polemical speculations that I offer. But the way in which I came to these conclusions is actually somewhat interesting, because I can quite literally pinpoint the exact line in A Song of Ice and Fire that led me down the path to ultimately believing that Daenerys Targaryen was the paramount antagonist of the story. Unlike a huge portion of die-hard A Song of Ice and Fire fans, I didn't actually get into the books until after I had seen the first season of Game of Thrones. After watching the debut installment of the series, I decided to read A Game of Thrones. I obviously enjoyed the book a lot, but what stuck out to me particularly was that the TV show was actually an incredibly faithful adaptation of the source material. Clearly not every element of the page can be translated to the screen, but in many instances, Game of Thrones the show was a near word-for-word remake of A Game of Thrones the book. And while A Song of Ice and Fire has obviously taken up a significant amount of my fan life, I am actually more of a film and TV nerd than a book nerd. I've voraciously watched movies since I was a kid, obsessively rewatched more TV shows than I can count, and got a degree in critical film studies in college. Essentially, the medium of film and television is just something that I tend to become more involved with, and tend to analyze and interpret more easily than books, and I really love seeing written content brought to life. So after reading A Game of Thrones post-season 1, I decided to read the books after watching the seasons themselves, so I could have an easier time playing all of these scenes and events on the page out in my own head. Season 2 was a similarly, nearly identical and awesome adaptation of A Clash of Kings. But unsurprisingly, Season 3 and A Storm of Swords were really big moments for both the TV show and books. And interestingly, it was here that I really started to fall down the rabbit hole of Daenerys Targaryen being an overt villain. Of course, this idea didn't just strike me overnight, and throughout Season 3 I was completely on board with the notion that Dany was the ideal savior who was going to use her power to save the world. Even by the end of the season, I didn't have the slightest inkling that she could be anything other than a true hero, and her entire arc through that season had solidified her as my favorite character in the story. And ironically, reading through A Storm of Swords also made me love Daenerys in retrospect, but from an entirely different point of view. Dany had plenty of unforgettable scenes in Game of Thrones, but nearly everyone will single out her liberation of the Unsullied in Astapor as one of the best moments in the entire series, and I would completely agree on that. It's uplifting, it's inspiring, and it's showing Daenerys coming into her own, taking power and using it in the best way possible. So suffice it to say, I was quite shocked at the book version of events. Interestingly, almost nothing is actually changed in the translation of this particular scene from A Storm of Swords to Game of Thrones. But the few words that are different were actually the first completely jarring clue that Dany was not the character that I thought she was. And she wasn't the character that the show was trying to portray either. In the TV series when she frees the Unsullied, she issues these commands. Unsullied, slay the masters, slay the soldiers, slay every man who holds a whip, but harm no child. Strike the chains off every slave you see. And in A Storm of Swords, Daenerys 3, she says this. Unsullied, slay the good masters, slay the soldiers, slay every man who wears a tokar or holds a whip, but harm no child under 12, and strike the chains off every slave you see. Ultimately, two words that were altered from the book to the screen are what eventually made all the difference in the way that I perceived Daenerys Targaryen. Because in the show, she tells the Unsullied to harm no child, but in the books, she tells the Unsullied to harm no child under 12. The caveat of killing no children under 12 is an incredibly disconcerting distinction. And quite frankly, I'm not at all surprised that the writers decided to tweak this bit of dialogue because it is so abruptly different from the Daenerys that they presented on the show. And because it would have been an astonishingly obvious indication that Dany was the bad guy very early on. It should be noted in the interest of fairness that the differences are distinguished for yet another reason as well. The Dany seen in Game of Thrones is clearly a young adult, while the Dany of the books is basically still a child herself. In an incredibly warped way, Dany's distinction of harming no children under 12 makes sense, because she doesn't really see herself as a child in most instances. And given that she had been married, gotten pregnant, and become a queen before the age of 13, it's likely not a coincidence or mistake that she sees other 13-year-olds as adults who can be sentenced to death without trial. But even with all of that said, the fact that Daenerys is directly ordering slaves to mass murder children is shocking and incredibly contradictory to the version of the character that Game of Thrones introduced to television viewers. And this particular line threw me off enough that I immediately double-checked to see if the TV scene was the same. I didn't instantly succumb to the idea that Daenerys was an outright villain, but the disconnect was startling and definitely meant something from a TV writing perspective. And that's really what tipped me off that something was up. Because yes, this particular line didn't fit with the Game of Thrones version of Daenerys. But if a writer is adapting material and does a nearly word-for-word translation of the book dialogue, then the fact that they have omitted something means that it's almost undeniably very intentional. So naturally, I started questioning what that intention was. Interestingly, I then discovered that there was a not insignificant faction of the overall A Song of Ice and Fire fandom who had clocked Daenerys as a clear villain from Book 1. And when I started reading back on Daenerys' earlier chapters, I realized that I could see shades of villainy quite early on as well. In fact, although I had unquestioningly accepted Dany's execution of Mirri Maz Duur as the right thing to do initially, in retrospect, that was the very first moment that I could see villainous subtext in Dany's character arc. As I moved forward in the story, I could see hidden angles of antagonism in Dany's decisions and actions that I had initially overlooked because I was so invested in her personal story and her point of view. And by the time I got back to the supposed liberation of the Unsullied in Astapor, my perspective on her character had radically changed. It's fascinating, because Game of Thrones clearly presents this moment as arguably Dany's most inspiring, but in retrospect, it was not hard to see her terrifying flaws in the source material. Firstly, ordering slaves to commit mass murder before freeing them is not quite the iconic girl boss moment that it might seem to begin with, especially when those slaves have been ordered to kill children. And while the most ardent Dany defenders argue that those children are somehow not children, even the A Song of Ice and Fire universe makes this distinction, as Robb kills Lord Karstark for killing Lannister hostages, who are still considered children at the age of 12 or 13. Even in the unlikely event that this wasn't an intentional choice on the part of George R.R. Martin to paint some nefarious subtext into Daenerys' decisions in Astapor, it's basically impossible for any rational person to argue that the tweens of an entire city deserve to be sentenced to violent death. But there are more unsettling aspects to this twist as well. Because firstly, it's safe to assume that the Unsullied weren't stopping to check ages. So any children who were younger than 12 but looked older were likely killed. And, while there is supposedly some mercy in allowing the younger children to live, children who are 11 or younger aren't capable of taking care of themselves. So the likelihood that they starved, were enslaved, were abused, or died in some other violent or horrific manner is extremely high. And interestingly, although the Tok'ar is an element of a socioculture that the TV series didn't even delve into, in Giscari culture, they are a garment that is worn by freeborn people. So, when she's telling the Unsullied to slay every man wearing a Tok'ar, she's not actually telling them to kill every slaver in Astapor. She's telling them to kill every freeborn adult man in Astapor, meaning that the freeborn people of the city who are not slave owners or traders are still being killed en masse. In fact, George R.R. Martin seems to go out of his way to bring attention to this, as the fringe of a Tok'ar indicates a man's status in Astapor. And during the sack in A Storm of Swords Daenerys 3, he makes a point of including this line. Aggo sat calmly notching arrows to his bowstring and sending them at Tok'ars. Silver, gold, or plain, he cared nothing for the fringe. So while this is a distinction that's even harder to catch, once it has been spotted, it obviously begs the question of why. Why kill so many of these people? Why kill many people who are probably relatively innocent? And why kill literal children? And the most obvious answer seems to be to eliminate anyone with any power or ability to potentially oppose Daenerys. Of course, that's entirely speculation, and given how simplistically Dany tends to look at a lot of situations, it's possible that this is more coincidental than intentional. However, the distinction of killing no child under 12 seems to be an incredibly deliberate choice on the part of George R. R. Martin, and Game of Thrones' decision to omit that particular tidbit seems to be a very obvious means of concealing the ultimate twist of Daenerys being the show's villain all along. Does that necessarily mean that Dany truly is the big bad of A Song of Ice and Fire? No. But it does mean that the Game of Thrones writers were fully aware of where Dany's character was going, and knew what they had to exclude from the books in order to make this twist as shocking as they possibly could. And the likelihood that this will end in Daenerys becoming an incredibly dark character in the books seems quite high. Ultimately, writers do not write heroes that mass murder children. And the fact that Dany can rationalize or outright ignore the genuine horror of her decisions does not mean that the audience is supposed to ignore it as well. Game of Thrones massively dropped the ball with Daenerys' character arc for a multitude of reasons. But one element that would have been nearly impossible to adapt was the point of view trap that George R. R. Martin has created with Dany. However, her villainy is not difficult to see once you start reading through the lines. And all it took were the two words, under 12, for me to eventually realize that Daenerys Targaryen is not the hero that most people want her to be. But what do you think? Can Daenerys be redeemed after killing the children of Astapor? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.